Next up, we have our legislative recap, and I am going to be a part of this panel. So I'm going to go ahead and invite my fellow panelists up. I hope they are here. I know Sarah is here. See Andy. And Brian's in the back. Okay, so we're going to make our way up to the stage, and I'll go ahead and get started when they get up here. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. One quick announcement before we get started. I can officially announce that the legislators for our 11 o'clock legislative panel are unfortunately not going to be able to make it today due to the special session, and there's going to be apparently some big vote earlier or later this morning, so they were not able to come. We have fortunately been able to rearrange some of our slides that were going to be, or presentations that were going to be in the breakout session, and move them to the general session. So we're still going to have presentations, but again, unfortunately, due to the special session, they will not be able to make it. So with that, we are up here today to talk about a very, very impactful legislative session. I've got an all-star group of panelists up here with me to talk about all things water and groundwater that happened during this past legislative session. So I'm very excited to announce or introduce these fine people. To my far left, we have Brian Sledge. He is a managing partner at Sledge Law. He's been a lobbyist for decades, 2-3 decades. I mean, very, very familiar face up at the Capitol. He's been through all of it, and we love having him up here and giving his perspective. To his right, we have Sarah Kirkle. She is the Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs, and my personal person that I go to whenever I have questions. She's the person that I look to when I need advice. So glad that she could help us out. And then to my immediate left, we have Andy Weir. He's the Executive Director of the Simsboro Aquifer Water Defense Fund. And I don't know if you want to say a few words about SAWDEF, but we'll leave that here for a minute. So before we dive into all the bills, and we do have a lot of bills to cover today, it was, again, a very prolific legislative session when it comes to water bills. I do want to kind of just give a general recap of the session. So, Sarah, I was hoping you could give us kind of a high-level overview of leadership and overarching themes, and maybe talk a little bit about the budget.
Yeah, so overall, the big three, the governor, lieutenant governor, and the speaker, got along really well. This is in contrast to previous sessions when that hasn't always been the case, and they passed a lot of their priorities, including property tax relief, vouchers, border security, the energy fund. And there are several other things that they didn't quite get to that are now on the agenda for the special session. So that would include THC, eliminating the STAR test, public funds and lobbying, some of these that not all of us in the 89th legislature was also one of the biggest water sessions in the history of Texas, and that's really exciting for us. We started out going into the session with a double-digit billion-dollar surplus. We had a $24 billion surplus. I think it was 27 the session before. There's a lot of competing priorities at the legislature for how to spend that money. So historically, it's been really difficult for the water community to be able to get some traction on investment in water infrastructure. But this session was different. And I think the game changer here was the governor declaring investment in water infrastructure an emergency item. And we're going to talk a little more about water infrastructure in just a bit, but I think that really sort of put water up to the top. So given that we thought for the water community, most of our time and attention is going to be spent on water infrastructure issues, it was really surprising to me to see the number of bills filed, but not just filed, but that passed that were related to groundwater. And I think that really shows that groundwater issues are becoming more and more prominent, and that there is an appetite to start having more conversations about how we approach groundwater management.
Thank you, Sarah. And Andy, can you provide us with a quick rundown on some of the numbers regarding bills and important water committees?
So start with the House, or You've got there, yeah. With Senate Water, Ag, and Rural Affairs is the top bar on the graph. Probably hard to make out those colors on the graph for y'all, but there were 183 bills total that came into the committee. 104 made it out of committee to the Senate floor. So more than I had the percentages here, 56% got out of committee. In the House, we had a total of 216 bills, and about 50% made it out of the House. So those committees are what's really important. The Senate Water, Ag, and Rural Affairs Committee, you had lots of veteran committee members. There were only 2 new members on that committee this session. And the chairman, Perry, had been there for the last 5 sessions. So you had a wealth of knowledge, and along with Senator Kolkhorst, who's senator for people that I represent. And so there was a wealth of knowledge and an ability to really grasp the issues, their interim committee work that they had done that helped to move those bills forward. In the House, it was a whole different affair. You had only 2 returning members in the House committee, and they expanded it from 11 to 13 members. But luckily, we had Chairman Harris, who was there as the vice chair in the 87th legislative session. So he has familiarity with that committee. And the only other member with history was Trent Ashby, and then the 2 returning members were Aaron Gomez and Aaron Sweener. So this is where I want to give a shout out to Texas Water Foundation and forming the Texas Water Caucus, because that was a big deal in helping to educate these members of that House committee. There were 2 or 3 freshman committee members, or freshman representatives on that committee too. So there was a real need for the Water Caucus and for that education. So if you can be a part of that, I think that's helpful, because they need that information to pass appropriate bills. And what am I missing here? Overall, okay. And then this legislative session, you can just see it's continuing the trend, right? Since the 85th legislative session up these last 5 sessions, more bills filed, but the same number of bills passed by the legislature. So there's lots of ideas, competing interests, but one good thing about the legislature is they're consistent in what gets passed and moved on to the governor.
Thanks, Andy. So now I just want to briefly talk about TAG's internal legislative process. So we have a legislative committee within TAG. It's about 85 of our members, and 73 of those are GCD members. And each legislative session, we identify any bills that are important or could impact districts. This session, we had a total of 43 actionable bills. These are bills that would directly affect Chapter 36 or any other operations regarding districts. And then once we identified those actionable bills, we discuss them within the committee and we form a position on those bills. So this session, we supported 24 of them. We were neutral on 9 and opposed 10 of them. In addition to that, there were 32 GCD local bills, 111 general water bills that we identified, and there were actually significantly more water bills, but a lot of those had to do with surface water or retail utilities, and so we didn't track those, but I think overall there was well over 300 water-related bills. And then we also tracked 81 government bills. So obviously the biggest conversation throughout the session was, the biggest conversation was water infrastructure and water funding. And I would ask Sarah to give us a quick overview of those 2 important bills so that, they weren't groundwater, but they, were very important to the water community. So could you share a little bit about those?
Absolutely. So, like I said before, this session was a landmark session for water. And the passage of HJR 7 culminated nearly 30 years of work by Texas water leaders, some of whom are in this room. One of them is next to me on the panel here that has worked tirelessly to find a dedicated funding source for water infrastructure. If passed in November, HJR 7, which has become Proposition 4 when you're voting on the ballot, will result in about $20 billion, $1 billion a year for the next 20 years for water supply, wastewater, and flood infrastructure for local communities across Texas. We're very thankful to our chairman, Chairman Perry and Chairman Harris, for their leadership on this issue. It was a really, really large lift for them. If you want to go to the next slide, Adam. So digging into HJR 7 first, like I said, it's $1 billion a year, and the way that that comes about is that the proposal would take $1 billion above a certain threshold, $46.5 billion that we currently get in sales tax and excise taxes, and dedicate that next $1 billion after that to the Texas Water Fund. HJR 7 had a couple of different pieces of it. It put some language in the statute related to an allocation for how that money can be spent. And during a state of disaster, it allows the legislature to actually go in and take that money if they need it for something else, which obviously isn't ideal, but it has the idea that it would be returned as soon as possible or as practicable. And it requires the legislature to appropriate funds from the Texas Water Fund, which is a new thing for water, because typically water funds have been constitutionally created and dedicated and kind of existed outside of the legislature's direct appropriation. So this will be a new thing to see how the legislature exercises that additional authority. But specific to groundwater, it also includes a provision that says that one of the board's financial assistance programs, called the New Water Supply for Texas Fund, funds from that program cannot be used to construct infrastructure or to transport groundwater that is not brackish. And then it will define what brackish groundwater is in general law, and I'm going to get to that here in a second. It does accept ASR wells if the injected water is based on surface water. And I'm going to cover that a little bit more if we can go to the next slide. So one of the biggest things that SB 7 did is consolidated all of the different Water Board financial assistance programs under one umbrella fund. So if you remember the last session, the goal of establishing the Texas Water Fund is that you have all these different financial assistance programs. They all have different project eligibility and types of entities who can apply for it, and it gets very confusing. So the goal here is simplify that by allowing the legislature to dump money into the water fund, and then based on the legislature's priorities, the board can then move that money around. Now, there are some other uses of the Texas Water Fund that aren't listed here, like a statewide awareness campaign and an administrative fund, but this shows all of the funds at this point that are financial assistance. The orange ones are the new ones that were added this time. I want to highlight the Ag Water Conservation Fund because I know a lot of GCDs rely on this program to help more efficient irrigation systems. If Proposition 4 passes and we get more money into the Texas Water Fund, that will be really helpful to the Ag Water Conservation Fund because they'll be eligible for additional funding. So I want to highlight, too, here the funding allocation restrictions. So when we first set up the Texas Water Fund last session, and there was a ballot initiative 2 years ago as well, 25% of that first $1 billion was required to go to the New Water Supply for Texas Fund. The allocation conversation during the legislative session was probably the area where there was the most tension in the legislature between the House and Senate on how to move forward. What they decided to do is say 50% of any money that goes into the Texas Water Fund now, half of that would go to New Water Supply and SWIFT, which is the program that funds our state water plan. And then the board has flexibility to spend that other 50% in whichever way that they see fit. And the reason that this water infrastructure conversation is relevant to groundwater is that there is a very strong reliance right now on fresh groundwater as one of our water supplies, and it's not an endless supply. So the goal here is if we infuse the board with additional funding for communities, that maybe we can expand that world of water supply and continue to have that conversation about if there are new water supply sources that we can rely on. Will you go to the next slide, Adam? And so that's why I want to talk about the New Water Supply for Texas Fund, because it's the one that has some groundwater components. And again, the goal here is to reduce our reliance on fresh groundwater and start thinking about how can we ensure that we're growing the pie of water supply options for the state. So the colors here indicate the first ones are the eligible project types that were from the last session. And the blue color is what changed this session. The important one to highlight is the piece about groundwater. So I said before that there's now a constitutional provision, it does have to pass in Prop 4, that says you cannot move fresh groundwater with money from this New Water Supply for Texas Fund. It's very confusing. And so as you get out there and start implementing this, you might see that the Constitution and the statutory language don't really match up, and it gets kind of confusing. The Constitution here is going to be what trumps, because obviously that's our big overarching government document. So it does have some implications for brackish and ASR and reuse if they are moving groundwater in it, but it really kind of depends on the project type. I would say the biggest addition here is the ability to move surface water through this fund, and probably the biggest prohibition and restriction is the one related to groundwater. But there's a lot of movement here. It looks like a lot of things were added, but there's also a lot of restrictions on how this money can be used. And so it's a big new fund that's not quite established. The board still has to do some rulemaking, but it is a really large part of what passed in SB 7. And last, I do want to highlight too that on the groundwater piece, they defined brackish groundwater as 3,000 TDS. That's total dissolved solids. So that's kind of a higher number compared to where at least some TWA members were looking at projects, because as we get off of fresh groundwater and we start looking at other brackish sources, there's a lot of interest in the more slightly brackish, like 1,500, 2,000 TDS. So 3,000 is very salty. It's much more expensive to treat. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out long term in terms of how people approach their projects in this funding.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a panel tomorrow to go over all of that. So thank you for that update. Now we're going to move into the important groundwater bills that passed. And first, I've asked Andy to talk about a bill that came from Representative Gertis, who I understand that you worked with him extensively in the interim, talking about bills that were important to you and the locals and within his district. So first up, we have one dealing with registered exempt wells. Can you give us a little rundown on this one?
Yes. So House Bill 1633. For those that were in Texas Water Association going back 8 years, that's where this bill originated. And that is to include in the criteria for granting a permit impacts to groundwater and surface water resources, other permit holders, and registered exempt wells as under Chapter 36. So that's been in the legislature for the last 8 years, always passed in the House. This year, we worked with Representative Gertis to file the bill again for the fifth time, but we also went to Senator Kolkhorst, who's on the Senate committee. For the first time, we got a Senate sponsor for that bill, and this time it passed. So that was big for landowners, for small farmers, ranchers, anyone with domestic livestock well. We're now part of the conversation. Many districts have included people in that conversation, but it wasn't in statute. And that was what's important, because in a contested case I was in, we were excluded because we weren't in statute. So we found this to be really important. Gertis did a lot of water bills. He filed 14 water bills, 8 of them got passed, and 1 was vetoed. And he reached out to our organization because we organize farmers and ranchers to protect their groundwater rights and to participate in their groundwater districts, in their GMA, in the DFC process, in regional planning groups. We try to encourage people to be a part of that process so that they're always considered and not because we can't afford to do it through contested cases. That's just impossible, right? So we need to be part of the process to make it work.
Absolutely. And TAG supported this bill as we did in previous sessions. And one thing I want to point out is one of the unintended benefits of this bill is that we hope that it will incentivize landowners to get their wells registered, their domestic and small livestock wells registered with y'all. So it would probably be a good idea for districts to come up with some sort of information that they can share with the people in their community about this bill and say, if you want to be considered in the permitting process, we need to know that your well is there, and otherwise we can't consider it, or we won't be able to consider it. So it's a very important bill. Next up, we have one dealing with the use of export fees. Andy, you want to cover this one?
Right. So if you remember the last session, 88, we passed the bill that allows districts to use export fees to mitigate wells that have lost artesian pressure through large permitting production. And so in GMA 12, all those districts were commenting that their impacts across the boundary lines, and they had the discussion about maybe we could form a joint mitigation fund. And they ran into obstacles about interlocal agreements and the sharing that public money. So this bill addresses that. It allows districts to enter into an interlocal agreement and merge their funds from the export fees to address joint mitigation, because they share joint responsibility for that depressurization of the aquifer.
Thanks, Andy. So next up, we've got a bill dealing with the transparency in the DFC process. Brian, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about this one.
Thank you, Adam. The next three bills were all bills that were recommended by the House Natural Resources Committee in its interim committee report to the 88th legislature, started in 2023. And picking up on what Andy noted, I think the most remarkable thing we saw this session was the willingness of the Senate and Senator Perry to pass proactive groundwater management bills. For the last 10 years, we've had a whole lot of bills that, even consensus stakeholder bills, that groundwater bills that made it through the House and found their brakes when they got over to the Senate. So the next four bills we're going to talk about were actually all carried by Senator Perry in the Senate, which, if you know anything about the Texas Senate water issues, makes a huge difference. This bill is really an accountability bill for groundwater conservation districts. They're charged under Chapter 36 with achieving the desired future conditions that are established for the aquifer. This makes them document in multiple places how they are monitoring and tracking their achievement of the DFCs and how they're doing. You now have to include that discussion in your management plan of the GCD. In the 5-year cycle of the joint planning process for establishing DFCs, the district representatives are already required to discuss each other's management plans. I don't know if I've seen very many robust discussions like that occurring over the last 20 years, but now they're going to also talk about how each district's doing. How are you tracking whether you're on track to achieve the DFC or not? And they have to document that discussion in the DFC explanatory report. And then the final thing, and I think perhaps the most important part of that bill, is that in addition to the approximately 50-year away DFCs that have to be established, the districts also have to establish interim milestones on how they're on track to achieve those DFCs in periods of no more than 10 years. So the thought being that this 50-year DFC is always 50 years away at any point in time. There's nobody that's sitting on a GMA right now that will ever be there to see whether the DFCs were achieved, because they're always 50 years away. So if we establish interim, if we say we want 100 foot of drawdown in 2080, perhaps we want 20 foot of drawdown by 2030, 40 foot of drawdown by 2040. These are things we can check along the way while the same players are still alive and participating. So that's 2078. So stirred up a lot of discussion.
Okay, next up, we have one that deals with the petition for inquiry process and some clarifying or clarifications in that process. Brian, you want to touch on this one a little bit?
Yeah, this one ain't too sexy. As many folks know, a person with a legally defined interest in groundwater can petition the TCEQ to claim that a district's groundwater district isn't doing its job in some way. They haven't adopted the DFCs. The rules or their enforcement of the rules aren't protective of groundwater resources. This petition process has run into a lot of hitches over time just because of lack of procedural details. This isn't really a sexy bill, but it goes in and fixes a number of the questions and procedures related to the Groundwater District Review Panel that's appointed by the TCEQ commissioners to look at these issues and make a report and a recommendation as if they were a little ALJ at SOA back to the TCEQ for action, whether their meetings are open meetings, how they're posted, how their records are. They're not a governmental body because they come and they're short-lived and they go, but how do we comply with the Public Information Act? How do they get legal counsel? This bill provides that the Office of Public Interest Counsel at the TCEQ would provide them legal advice because some of them were having to use, they're volunteers to start with. They were having to pay for their own lawyers, their own transportation expenses. This makes them whole on that front. It was a good bill.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, next up, we have one dealing with artesian wells and some outdated language in the water code. Sarah, do you want to talk about this one briefly?
Yeah, so the outdated language here really preceded the creation of GCDs and the modern drilling regulations that you have at TDLR. So what the bill does is it eliminates some obsolete reporting requirements at TCEQ, and it makes it very clear that the remaining provisions related to artesian wells only apply outside of a GCD or subsidence district.
Thanks. And Brian, up next is one dealing with enforcement mechanism or enforcement tools for districts. You had a huge hand in this one, so could you explain a little bit about this one?
Yeah, I got sucked into the vortex working on this one and barely escaped the event horizon. This started back a couple of years ago. Senator Perry had called me after some lawsuits from some very well-financed permit holders against some underfinanced groundwater districts, asking if GCDs had the tools that they needed in the statute to make sure that they could enforce their rules and their permits. And we took it over to TWA and the legislative stakeholders process and considered a bunch of things, but the only thing that gained any traction was jacking up the civil penalty amounts from $10,000 per day cap that's been there since 2001, I think, to $25,000 per day. There was a question on whether that was really needed because most districts that have current $10,000 a day enforcement authority never use it. Their fines are typically much less than that. We didn't have anybody in the room that had ever done it that I was aware of, but the thought was that at least for huge projects, maybe billion-dollar groundwater projects, if the most that you could fine them was $10,000 a day, the biggest fine you could assess would be $3.65 million a year. That might just be the cost of doing business for some of these folks. So that led to anyway, we didn't get consensus on that at TWA, but Senator Perry ran with it anyway, and as we got into the discussions, and Cody Harris filed this. Cody Harris filed this in the House, and Senator Perry in the Senate. Ultimately, the House bill passed. But the biggest thing was this discussion of, we're increasing these fines, but what are the groundwater districts going to do with them? So what was put into the bill, one, was a balancing test similar to what I see in a lot of groundwater district rules on how a district decides what penalty they're going to assess based upon the egregiousness of the violation. Did it hurt others? What was the level of culpability? Did you have a malfunction in equipment that caused you to overpump, or were you just blatantly disregarding? We took all of those criteria, kind of compliance history criteria, and setting penalties out of the TCEQ's Administrative Penalty Authority statute in Chapter 7 of the Water Code, and basically pulled those wholesale into Chapter 36 with a little groundwater twist to them. Also allowing a court, it's a district judge that assesses civil penalties, not a groundwater district, a district court to consider these factors to defer up to half of the civil penalty that is assessed, to allow the applicant to do corrective action with those fines instead of just paying them to the groundwater district. And this is much akin to TCEQ's supplemental environmental project SEP process, where, especially with like struggling little rural water systems, maybe they're busting their permit because they have too many leaky pipes along long stretches of country roads. They don't have the funds to put them back in. This would allow a judge to defer half the civil penalties to say, yeah, you can go, fix leaky pipes with this, and you have to comply with the court order to do it. If you fail to comply with the court order, the full amount goes to the groundwater district. So, finally on that, we had a number of discussions. A lot of the discussions here were with the investor-owned utilities and their lobbyists. They complain that, while, we have drought come along, the groundwater district may be curtailing pumpage in the drought. We can't get we're not a governmental entity. We can't get our customers to stop pumping and putting water on their grass. This would allow the judge to, if he determines that the civil penalties were no fault of the public water supplier, but it was their customers, even though the public water supplier was diligently pursuing implementation of its drought contingency plans, which may be no lawn watering during the week or whatever, that investor-owned utilities could go in and recover those fines from customers or customer classes to make them whole. And that's a big change in the law.
Thank you, Brian. So the last bill that we want to talk about that passed was Senate Bill 1583 by Senator Blanco. And this one came as a result of a legislative recommendation from the Texas Water Development Board in their legislative report. And it essentially says that a district, if a district's DFC has been petitioned or found to be unreasonable, it clarifies which DFC to use. And it states that the most recent DFC and the associated MAG value would be put in the management report. If a DFC is updated, and then it has 2 years to update the DFC. And then it also states that when they're adopting the DFC, or until the petitions process is finalized, they'll use that DFC in the management plan. So again, this one came from a recommendation from the Texas Water Development Board. TAG supported it. This one flew through the legislature. I mean, I think this is one of the first water bills that got passed and signed by the governor. It was done by the end of April, early May, something like that. So this was just a very plain, simple bill that was much needed, and legislators understood that. So
Former consensus.
Oh, it's a former consensus bill. Thank you for that. So next, I would like to talk about a few bills that didn't pass, just because, we typically see bills reappear in future sessions. So there's a few of these that I want to have our panelists talk about and just give an overview of kind of what happened during the process, why did they fail, and if they think that we may see them again in future sessions. So first up, we've got a pair of attorney's fees bills, and Brian, I was hoping you could touch on these very briefly.
Yeah, we've had so many of these bills over the last as many legislative sessions as I can remember to change the recovery of attorney fee standards from presently a one-way street, which is the groundwater conservation districts, if they prevail, are entitled to recover their attorney's fees in a lawsuit that they don't start, or in recovery of an enforcement case to enforce their rules. The bill by Representative DeRazio, House Bill 1050, would have been a loser pays bill. Prevailing party gets their attorney's fees. That bill didn't go anywhere. Mano Ayala, Republican representative from Houston, who evidently had a close personal friend who was aggrieved by some actions of one of the groundwater districts up in the Hill Country, filed 2805, which was kind of a prevailing party gets attorney's fees bills, but it also had a whole lot of weird and convoluted stuff that never did get worked out. It died in the committee as well, but it wasn't for lack of having a good chance. It was one of these whack-a-mole deals. Every time it looked like it was dead, it kept getting called up and scheduled for a vote, but the votes turned out not to be there, and it didn't get out of committee.
Thank you, Brian. So next up, we have House Bill 1400. This bill would have created a fund within Texas Water Development Board or in the state treasury for $15 million. The fund would be accessible to districts for data and science needs. There was a very large consensus in the legislature and the members on the House Natural Resources Committee that there needed to be more resources available to districts for science and data gathering needs. Another thing that was very encouraging about this bill was EDF, specifically Vanessa, had worked with about 25 associations from around the state to get their support, which if you saw the list of associations that had come together on this bill, I mean, you were thinking you were in the twilight zone because it was a bunch of groups that normally are at odds with each other, but Vanessa was able to pull everybody together in support of this bill. Had broad support in the House, passed out of the House Natural Resources Committee, made it past the chamber, got over to the Senate side, and the Lieutenant Governor had some issues with creating another fund within the Treasury for the board with all the money that was already going with SB 7. So he liked that money was going to districts. He just did not want to create another fund. So instead of the $15 million, we were able to secure $7.5 million in the state budget. And again, this will be administered, those funds will be administered by the board to help districts with their science and data gathering needs. But I do want to show our appreciation. This was a big bill for TAG, and Vanessa and Leah Martinson, the former executive director here, worked tirelessly to get those funds secured. So I want to acknowledge those efforts. So it didn't pass, but we got some iteration of it passed. So next up, we have a transparency bill that was vetoed by the governor. Andy, do you want to touch on this one briefly?
So this is another one coming out of GMA 12, those 5 districts. Or the 3 big districts there, Brazos Valley, Post Oak, Savannah, and Lost Pines. All of the big export permits in those, or the big production permits in general, are within 1 mile to 3 miles of the boundaries of these districts. And so they have significant impacts across those district boundaries. And notification, when there's an application for these permits, doesn't go to the neighboring county. It doesn't necessarily go to the neighboring district. And so people are not aware that just 3 miles away, somebody's going to be depressurizing your aquifer, your well. And you don't have a chance to participate in the process. So that's what this bill was that you had to notify every neighboring county commissioner's court and judge, and you had to notify any connected district, and you had to publish in a newspaper at the cost to the applicant in those surrounding areas. So we thought this was a good bill. The governor's veto just says there are notification provisions currently in Chapter 36, and those should be sufficient. So I have talked with Representative Gerdes about working with on this bill again and finding out if there's some way to tweak it just a little bit so that it is acceptable and we can get this bill passed and more people can participate in the permitting process.
Thank you, Andy. So next up, we have one talking about water rights and the water trust. Sarah, could you very briefly talk about this one?
Yeah, so this one is a little bit complicated, but the Texas Water Trust is one where you can dedicate water rights, and the statute seems very clearly geared towards surface water. And it doesn't say you can't dedicate a groundwater right, but when the application came in to the Water Development Board, they got a little concerned that because there are clear processes for TCEQ and Parks and Wildlife to approve those rights, there wasn't anything specific to that on the groundwater side. So the bill would have done that, would have required water board approval and notification to GCDs. I think there were some concerns about, because GCDs don't have a clear mechanism to protect that right, whether or not a dedication of groundwater rights would be meaningful. Others would argue, of course, that if you have a proactive GCD, they can choose to protect that right and use management zones and other tools. So, but ultimately, this one did not pass.
Thank you. Next one, we had a very interesting bill, and it would have made significant changes to exempt well criteria. Andy, you want to touch on this one?
Oh, so I am really ignorant on this, so I had to go to Doug Shaw, and I will point you to him to get the full skinny on this. But freshman Representative Olcott presented this bill. And what I learned from Doug is that there's an issue of death by 1,000 straws, particularly in Parker County, which is represented by Representative Olcott. And without turning to experts or looking for groundwater experts, he attempted to address that issue by trying to reduce exempt pumping. And the bill kind of created 2 exempt classes of wells. And it didn't get a hearing. It just didn't go anywhere. And again, I want to give a shout out to that water caucus and the ability to educate legislators. That's a perfect example of where a freshman legislator could have benefited from the education that's available through the water caucus and could have made that bill more proactive. And for legislators to reach out to their groundwater districts for advice on how to address these.
Thank you. Next up, we have a couple of bills that dealt with the clarification in the groundwater availability certification process. TAG worked extensively over the interim with TCEQ to try to get some clarifications in their rules regarding what constitutes, I can't even think of the name right now, but
Credible
evidence, sorry.
Groundwater.
Yeah, credible evidence. We were unsuccessful in that, so we were happy to see some legislation to address those concerns that we had. And Sarah, I was hoping you could talk to those real quick.
Yeah, so previous session, Senate Bill 2440 required that if you're going to submit as a developer a plat application for a new subdivision, you have to attach a statement of adequate groundwater availability. And there were some implementation questions around that Adam is referencing, and the TCEQ rules never defined what a credible evidence of sufficient groundwater availability were. So this bill would have clarified that and then put some additional implementation provisions around cities and or counties when they get that application, and if they don't have that sufficient groundwater supply, that they would have to deny that plat application.
Thank you. Okay, next group of bills had to do with the designation of brackish groundwater production zones and also the permitting from those. The first one, Senate Bill 2658 by Perry. TAG was neutral on this bill. The filed version would essentially take away the exemption process from GCDs. We tried to work with Senator Perry's staff to get some language added. We were not able to get consensus on that. Ultimately, some subsequent versions did have the ability for monitoring or requirements for monitoring to be in place, and if it was shown that water being withdrawn from a brackish groundwater production zone had impacts to freshwater portions or up dip of the brackish groundwater production zone, then that the district could then revoke the exemption status. Another aspect of this bill is it changed how the brackish groundwater production zones are actually designated. One being that currently there's an exemption where if you cannot designate an area as a brackish groundwater production zone if it's within 15 miles of a Class 2 injection well. And so we were very much opposed to that. And again, this bill didn't pass. I do have a feeling that we are going to see some version of it next session. It is one of Senator Perry's, if you listen to what he says, I mean, that's the way he wants to go. He wants to incentivize brackish groundwater production, and he sees these brackish groundwater production zone as the key to a lot of areas and supplying water to a lot of areas. So I do think we're going to see some similar legislation next session. House Bill 5188, it specifically addressed the brackish groundwater production zone designation in those injection well buffer areas. So it removed that criteria from the exemption process. And both of these luckily died in the House. They did not receive any major attention or significant enthusiasm in the House. So next, I would like to talk about a few government bills. We are kind of running low on time, and I do want to briefly touch on the special session. So hopefully we can get through these pretty quickly. First one, we have House Bill 1522. This has to do with some posting requirements, especially in regards to budgets. Andy, could you briefly talk about this one?
Correct. So that's, again, from Gerdes, and that's good government bill that basically requires 3 business days for posting, if especially your agenda, especially when it includes a budget.
Previously, it was 72 hours, and now it's
Right.
three business days.
And this wasn't targeted at groundwater districts. This was actually targeted at municipal government, but y'all are part of the collateral, or you're caught in the net of government process. So it's 3 business days for posting. And if you're doing the budget, you have to include a copy of that budget. And if it's your tax-based, and there's 66 districts here that have tax-based, then you're going to have to post a tax statement that says this is what the impact is going to be if you're making any changes to your tax rate. What's going to be the impact to an average household tax bill?
Thank you. Next up, we have House Bill 3512 dealing with artificial intelligence training, and hopefully everybody enjoyed that presentation yesterday by Chris. Sarah, can you talk about the requirements for this bill?
Yeah, so this is just like the cybersecurity training. If you are an employee of a state agency or local government and you use a computer for 25% of your required duties, you have to take AI training. And the Department of Information Resources has to develop those programs. So once they do that, then that requirement will kick in.
Yeah. And within TAG, as soon as we get information on the training, we will be sharing that with our members as well. So the next one, it deals with public information requests. Sarah, you want to touch briefly on this one as well?
Yeah, so if I'm a government entity and Andy is submitting a public information request and I don't have any information to respond to him, or if I have an attorney general determination that I can withhold that information, I don't have to respond to Andy at all. So Andy's out here like, you didn't even respond to me. What the hell? Like, somebody tell me what's going on. You're ignoring me. So this bill fixes that, and it says, I have to tell Andy what's going on, that either I don't have the information or I have an AG opinion to withhold that. And if I don't get back to him, it sets up a complaint process so that Andy can go to the AG and say, this governmental entity didn't respond to me. And if the Attorney General finds that the government entity has violated that requirement, it can require additional open records training.
That's good. I mean, that will save a lot of anxiety and hostility on the basis of landowners.
All right, thank y'all. Next up, we have Senate Bill 480 by Perry. Brian, you want to talk about this interlocal contract?
Yeah, this was a bill Senator Perry filed in response to a little brouhaha that flared up down in GMA 14 on questions on whether there was legal authority for the subsidence districts or counties without a groundwater conservation district to enter into interlocal agreements with the groundwater districts to help participate in joint planning. And Perry just put an end to that discussion by amending the Interlocal Cooperation Act to say that any governmental entity, local government, state government, federal government, can contract with one another to do research or water research or planning activities.
Thank you. And our last government bill, this one was really targeted to rural government entities. So this allows an alternate way of notifying the public. So in areas where they may not have a local newspaper that's reliable or it's gone out of business for whatever reason, this allows districts to use online newspaper services. Now there are some criteria, including it has a paid subscriber base. The online newspaper has to have been in business for more than 3 years, and it has to be updated at least a week. So this just allows some easier reporting in rural areas of Texas. Okay, last, we do want to talk about one government bill that didn't pass. We had a lot of involvement here at TAGD in this bill, and I do think that there are still some concerns within the legislature, and I suspect we'll see something like this going forward or in future sessions. So, Sarah, can you talk briefly about this one?
Yeah, so this bill would have required groundwater, general water, and navigation districts to record and put on their website a internet audio and video recording of your board meetings. So lots of other political subdivisions already have this requirement. There were some changes in a committee substitute that would have only applied the video piece to districts that have a part of that district in a county with a population over 125,000, but the bill ultimately still failed. But the concerns out there really fall into 3 categories. It's the cost of it, it's the sophistication to be able to put it on the website, and then it's internet access.
Thank you. So now talk about some local bills, and I'm going to run through these pretty quickly. First one is Senate Bill 1194. This creates the Central Texas Water Alliance. Dirk and Clearwater Underground Water Conservation District worked very closely with Senator Flores to get this passed. This just creates the regional alliance and gives them some authority as regards to eminent domain and being able to collect some taxes. And essentially, I foresee a lot of areas in the state looking to them kind of as a template going forward. We may see some more regionalization groups like this. So it would be important for people to kind of understand what the alliance is about and what their plans are. The next one is a very simple bill, House Bill 4158. Previously, the board of directors were not able to be compensated for their work for the district. This just allows them to be compensated. House Bill 5320 by Guillen, sorry. This one combines the Starr County GCD with the Starr County Drainage District. There was some issues with funding the district. So the district was put in place back in the 2013-2015 area time frame, and they were never able to get a confirmation election or approved for taxing authority. And so they always struggled with funding the district, and essentially what this bill does is it just combines the 2 districts, and so that they're going to be able to fund and properly manage the groundwater resources in Starr County. This one goes in effect on 9/1, so starting next month they will be combined, and my understanding right now is they're trying to figure out how it's going to be represented there. So next one is Senate Bill 616 by Senator Schwertner. This one is an ASR bill. So previously they were not allowed to do ASR type projects through the Edwards Aquifer in Medina County and in eastern portions of Williamson County. So this just allows them to do that now. So there's several projects in the works or planned, and so previously they weren't allowed to do that, and now they can do this or do that. Lastly, we have Senate Bill 1055. This deals with production fees from Southeast Texas GCD. It increases the cap from 1 cent to 7 cents for 1,000 gallons of production. So next we have a few local bills that did not pass. Brian, I was hoping you could talk briefly about these.
Absolutely. First, we had Senate Bill 1959, which amended the Enabling Act of the North Texas GCD. That's up in Collin, Denton, and Cook County. They've got an issue with the proliferation of amenity ponds for commercial developments, and they wanted to be able to take that into consideration in their permitting decisions. That bill made it out of the Senate, but didn't make it through the time process in the House. 2660 by Perry amended the Enabling Act of the Hayes Trinity GCD, which has never had a reliable funding mechanism. They have neither taxes nor production fee authority, and aren't really financially equipped to do their job. In addition, there's a bunch of special interest provisions that deviate from Chapter 36 that kind of tie their hands on regulating folks. And Senator Perry, who had carried a fee increase bill for the other half of Hayes County from Barton Springs and got it passed the last session, carried it this session. It made it out of the Senate, not out of the House. It was tacked on as an amendment to another bill, and then that bill got vetoed by the governor. So it ultimately failed. Senate Bill 3058 by by Colcourse amended Gary Westbrook's Post Oak Savannah Enabling Act to not just allow, I didn't know this when I talked to you, Gary, wherever you are, but required the district to use some of that export fee money to give it over to the county to help improve county roads. Interesting concept. That didn't make it through the whole process either.
Thanks, Brian. So last four bills that we want to talk about, these are general water bills that I just wanted to make sure that everybody in this room was aware about. So the first one is Senate Bill 1145, dealing with the application of produced water. Andy, do you want to touch very briefly on this one?
It's real simple. It moved the control or the standards for application of produced water from Railroad Commission to TCEQ, so that all of that's handled by TCEQ because they were already doing water quality.
Went too far.
Oh, you done?
Yeah, it's over.
Okay, Senate Bill 1663 by Zaffarini. This just adds to the notification of groundwater contamination by TCEQ. So right now, when there is a notice or an area of groundwater contamination, TCEQ is required to notify people within a certain distance of that contamination. Previously, they could be sent by mail or posted in a local newspaper. This adds that they can send it directly to them without being a certified mail. It also allows them to contact all landowners within 1 mile of the contamination and not just well owners. So this just this incorporates people that may have a well that may not necessarily be known by TCEQ. If it's an older well that's not in the system or the GC doesn't know about it, this will allow them to be notified of that contamination. Next one is Senate Bill 2662, talking about drought contingency plans. I know, Brian, you had a huge hand in this one as well, so could you touch on that one?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most important bills that passed this session.
Yep.
It was an issue that we took up again during the TWA legislative stakeholders process during the interim. Didn't get consensus, but what it does, it goes back to the discussion we had when I was talking about the civil penalties increase bill and the investor-owned utilities claiming, you know, we can't enforce our drought contingency plans. We're not governmental entities like the cities or the water districts. We can't enforce rules and things like that. And that may partially be true. A lot of it has to do with the fact that these are for-profit entities and there's a lot of profits to be made in drought selling water. regardless of the motives, this bill takes away that. This bill basically just codifies in statute the current TCEQ and Public Utility Commission rules that some folks like to pretend weren't there, or maybe they thought they weren't statutorily authorized to do so. But it makes real clear that public water suppliers get their drought contingency plans approved by the TCEQ, including in that specific enforcement measures to cut back production by users of those public water systems, including discontinuation of service, putting in flow restrictions on folks, fines and penalties, and gives that authority not just to the governmental public water suppliers, but also the investor-owned utility public water suppliers, and then also requires that those drought contingency plans be included in an approved tariff at the Public Utility Commission. Investor-owned utilities rates, water rates, and services are governed by their tariffs. These are approved by the Public Utility Commission. They're both the service conditions and the rates. And this says that the drought contingency plan is part of that. And those terms on how you would enforce it, shutting people off for watering when they weren't supposed to be watering, all of that, gives all that explicit authority and says you shall do it. So getting tough about cutting back during droughts.
Thanks, Brian. And the last bill that I want to talk about is Senate Bill 2885 by Flores. So there was a big push this session to increase water sources, and one of the ways to do that is through ASR. One of their ideas was to use reclaimed water, which is essentially just treated wastewater, treated water. And this allows the TCEQ to authorize by permit or general rule the injection of reclaimed water in an ASR project. So previously there wasn't any guidance from the legislature, and this just gives that guidance. So with that, we are out of the bills that we're going to talk about today, and we do have a few minutes for questions. I was hoping to talk about the special session, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So if you do have any questions about the special session, I invite all of our participants to reach out to myself or one of these three panelists out in the hall, and hopefully we'll be able to give you some information on it. So, Sarah, did you want to say something?
I do want to say, come November 4th, please vote for Prop 4.
Yes,
Remember to do that.
absolutely.
We're starting to work on materials, and if you want to follow all that, follow us on TWA and our social media. We'll have toolkits and all the stuff to help you put that out to the folks to teach them.
And TAG will be sharing. I know your association and Texas Water Foundation is working on some materials, and so we're going to be absolutely sharing those with our members and hopefully having them send it on out and through all their social medias and everything. So, Brian, did you want to say something?
I got two things I want to say.
Okay.
One, I want to commend you and your trusty sidekick, Doug Shaw, head of the TAG Legislative Committee, for stepping into this job. First time I think you've dabbled seriously over at the legislature. Mm-hmm. You had some pretty big old shoes to fill with Leah's departure.
Yep.
And her capableness. And you did a great job. And
Thank you.
You spent a lot of time up there, and this organization owes you a debt of gratitude. And Doug, too, in the head. Yeah.
Thank you. Y'all were very helpful in guiding me and reassuring me, so I appreciate y'all.
It's a really sick sausage making process, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I learned a lot.
Enough to make you sick to your stomach. Yeah. The other thing, and I had a bunch of meetings at the Capitol yesterday and a board meeting last night, so I don't know what was said about this year's sledge law magnetic koozies that were passed out, but probably Robert May said something. Yeah. There are 21 hidden groundwater-related acronyms in that puzzle. And I'll say that, and there's evidently a few other words that I didn't even know were buried in there that some people have told me about, but I'll say that the first three folks who hand me a list of those 21 acronyms are going to get a free bottle of Sledge Distillery pecan whiskey.
Nice.
Little incentive.
Wow. I know what everybody's going to be doing during the break.
Can I?
Absolutely.
I want to say thank you to TAG, to Sarah and Texas Water Association. I'm so wet behind the ears when it comes to groundwater. I got involved in this only 6 years ago. I didn't know what an aquifer was, and I'm pretty much immersed in it because I retired from state government. But I've been educated. Texas Water Association, Texas Water Foundation, people like Brian, when I see him at conferences and he tells me, you know, this is how this goes. Vanessa, Pugh Williams, Carlos, Dr. Mace, and especially Mr. Greg Ellis, who's been very supportive. And I want to encourage you, if you have landowners in your district that want to be involved, to direct them to these organizations so that they can participate and learn and benefit from that. It will take the stress off of you as general managers, as board members, because there's a lot of anxiety as a landowner about your groundwater, and that's the way we think of it. And we can make this a much more cooperative and win-win process. It doesn't have to be adversarial. It can be win-win if you get informed people participating with you. So please direct your landowners to those organizations.
Thank you, Andy. I think we have time for one question. Nope, nobody coming up. All right, well, let's give our panelists a huge round of applause again.